And I was reading an article that led me to another article that took me to the work of someone named Dr. Dana Jack, and I wish I'd shared her work sooner on this channel. Over 30 years ago, she developed a theory called silencing the self theory. And she believed that this theory explains some of the gender differences we see in depression and may explain some of the reasons that we see the greater prevalence of depressive disorders in women. People in narcissistic relationships blame themselves. It's what you do, right? If it's your fault, then you can fix it, you can change it, and then you can keep the relationship going, maintain the status quo. Blaming yourself is part of the larger system of justification that people go through in these relationships. Things like, oh, I'm being too demanding, I'm asking too much of them, they don't mean it, they had a tough day, that kind of thing. So as you know, this month I'm talking about some concepts that I share in my new book, It's Not You. And self-blame is a core aspect of the fallout of narcissistic abuse, which takes us to chapter 3. People in narcissistic relationships often think that they're the bad one, that maybe you're the one who's doing something wrong. Maybe you are a bad person for even thinking that this person is narcissistic, especially if you think you're supposed to think of them as a nice person. But at the same time, the narcissistic person, believe it or not, thinks that they're a good, even a great person. This is actually one of the great mind F's of the narcissistic relationship. They genuinely think that they are nice people. They may describe themselves as empathic, generous, as a good person. They will say that, I'm a good person. And at least most of the way down, they really believe it. When they say that, I don't even think we can really quite call it gaslighting, even though it is, frankly, an alteration of reality. At some level, it even feels like a delusion. But it can also leave you feeling hopeless and helpless, because it's one thing if the narcissistic person is walking around and thinking like, I'm not a very nice person, no wonder she's mad at me, or, ugh, I'm a rotten person, but deal with it because I'm rotten. But that's not what they believe. To maintain their perfectionistic exterior and get supply, part of that unprocessed process for them is that they think of themselves as great, good, nice, cool, helpful. Every so often, you may find the narcissistic person who will say, yeah, I know I'm an a-hole. That's how I get deals closed. That's how I get things done. But that's often posturing. That sort of, aren't I so cool, I'm so successful because I'm a badass sort of thing. But if you were to dig a little deeper, you will find that they probably think they're a nice person. Now, obviously, the interesting thing about narcissism is like a complicated layer cake. If you were to go all the way into their deepest core, they feel terrible, but they aren't in touch with that sense of terribleness that they have all these defenses against. Because people in narcissistic relationships blame themselves, and at the same time, the narcissistic people are firmly convinced that they are good people, this can really cement the self-blame dynamic. Remember, self-blame is a sort of attachment response. If it's your fault, then there's something to be done. The other person, who you often feel you need, isn't bad, and then you can maintain the relationship by doing things to yourself, by fixing yourself. Obviously, for a child, the opposite of that would be catastrophic, to believe that their parent is bad and that they have knowing that they have nowhere else to turn. And so we start a long-term process of accommodating and modifying ourselves in 1,000 different ways so we can maintain the relationship and the illusion that someday the narcissistic person will change or the relationship will get better. Since we know self-blame is such a characteristic part of the fallout of narcissistic abuse, just to have a summary and a review, let's take a look at 5 ways that self-blame shows up in your behavior in a narcissistic relationship. Number 1, constant apologizing, and I mean constant. And this behavior generalizes, you know what I mean. You say things like sorry when all you do is walk through a door. You say sorry for eating. You apologize constantly for just your mere existence, and not just with the narcissistic person. It starts to show up everywhere. It makes sense. It's part of the cycle of appeasing the narcissist. But every time we apologize, we are basically acknowledging that we did something wrong when we didn't. And in time, it becomes a sort of indoctrinated pattern in these relationships because they are also always shifting blame onto us. But if we apologize, and when we apologize, we're basically saying, I did something bad. That's why I'm saying I'm sorry. And over time, internally, we psychologically shift to believe that. And before long, we think of ourselves as bad people. Number 2 sign of self-blame is walking on eggshells and chronic appeasing. This builds on that first point I made, but it's a sort of constant hypervigilance people have in these relationships. As a narcissistic relationship proceeds, you become more and more careful about what you say and what you do, because sometimes saying good things gets you in trouble. Sometimes saying bad things gets you in trouble. And after a while, you just don't know what sets the narcissistic person off. So you waste time choosing every word with absolute ridiculous precision. And so when they get angry, you may blame yourself for not being careful enough on those eggshells, rather than the simple fact that their behavior, their inflexibility is completely unacceptable. Number 3 is when you take the blame for things that are not your fault, or simply just blame yourself for things that are not your fault. Now, narcissistic folks will not take responsibility or be accountable. They just want. Well, so we often do. And that is obviously linked to how self-blame develops and how it shows up for us. It's an interesting issue. Because when something goes wrong in life, there's always this sense that someone has to be responsible for it. And since A, they won't take responsibility, and B, will gaslight you and tell you that you're responsible or that it's your fault, taking the blame is a common way that survivors experience these relationships. Number 4 is over-preparation and doing everything. This is an interesting sort of sign of self-blame, or it's also an interesting sort of process, because people in narcissistic relationships are often called out as being control freaks. Has that ever happened to you? Have you ever been called the control freak in the relationship, despite the narcissistic person being so controlling? But this actually may be more about the self-blame and management of the relationship. In narcissistic relationships, you may recall that you got 100 details right. For example, you're doing something like planning a family vacation or a big project at work. The narcissistic person will do very little, but they'll have no problem weighing in with all kinds of suggestions. They actually do nothing, and then they critique you for what you did or didn't do, or rage at you for what you forgot. They didn't notice the 100 things you did, by the way. So this can result in a correction in this can result in a correction in people who are in narcissistic relationships. And you just keep trying to get it righter and righter. You pack for every contingency that could go wrong on the trip and still try to fit it all into a carry-on bag because they won't check the bags. You overthink the details. So much of this relates to the idea that it's always your fault when things go wrong. So by trying to overdo, over-prepare, try to manage every little detail, you try to get it perfect so you don't have to either literally incur the wrath of the narcissistic person or hear their internalized voice, even if they're out of your life. Oh, you got it wrong again. All of this can mean that you spend far more time doing stuff than you need to, or with more detail than anybody else. Number 5 sign of self-blame is mind reading. The idea that you actually believe you need to or can read someone else's mind to anticipate their needs. It's absolutely ridiculous, and yet it's how most people in narcissistic relationships have to function. The narcissistic person is entitled enough to believe that you should have known what they were thinking and genuinely anticipated what they wanted or needed, and even how they wanted you to respond. So you may genuinely think you can do those things. And so when things go wrong, instead of recognizing that they're being unreasonable, and also that it is impossible to read another person's mind, that an adult is responsible for communicating what they need, you may fall into a cycle of, damn it, I should have known that. I should have expected that. In some cases, survivors may even feel as though they were selfish for not being able to mind read. The blame shifting and unrealistic expectations of the narcissistic relationship and the tendency for survivors to blame themselves can result in this unrealistic expectation that if we could just figure out what they want, everything would be fine. I have more patterns included in this book, so please go check it out and learn about the rest of them, because they may be part of how you have responded to the relationship. There is a beautiful moment in healing from these relationships where you start to blame yourself less, when the radical acceptance really kicks in. And yes, it is a beautiful moment, because once that part of the cycle starts to slowly stop, the trauma bond will slowly disintegrate. When it comes to thinking about self-blame, and every time you keep wondering, was this my fault? Is it me? Remember, it's not you. You know that in order for a narcissistic relationship to work, you have to shut yourself down. The relationship is based on your convenience to them. If you're of no convenience to them, you're not bringing anything to the table, they need something, they'll be there and they'll get it. And you learn over time in these relationships, you give it to them when they want it. And then that's when the relationship works. If they want food or sex or work or time, repairs, caregiving, anything, whatever it is, depending on the relationship. And should you give it to them when they want that thing, and if you really want to hit it out of the park with them in the relationship, you anticipate what they want and you give it to them before they even know they want it. If you can do that, well, then you've created the perfectly symbiotic, well, singular, one-way biotic narcissistic relationship. So if you sacrifice all of you and be exactly what they want to be, basically a cyborg, the relationship will work. If you were to have no feelings, no needs, no wants, no beliefs that are different than theirs at least, and if you have feelings and needs that you're good, as long as your feelings and needs are aligned with theirs and they're never different. In other words, if they're happy, you have to be in a good mood. If they're having a bad day, you need to be dejected too. And certainly make none of your needs known on those bad days for them either. If they believe something to be true, you don't contradict them. And you don't ever want to ask them for something they don't already want. Does that make sense? There is your recipe for how to make a narcissistic relationship work. But the fact is, the very things you would have to do to make a narcissistic relationship work is not good for you. And I was reading an article that led me to another article that took me to the work of someone named Dr. Dana Jack, and I wish I'd shared her work sooner on this channel. Over 30 years ago, she developed a theory called silencing the self theory. And she believed that this theory explains some of the gender differences we see in depression and may explain some of the reasons that we see the greater prevalence of depressive disorders in women. Now, her original work, again, from quite a while ago, focused on women in relationships and understanding for those women what contributed to their depression. She looked at them over time, and what she observed is that the depressed women silenced themselves. They silenced themselves so they wouldn't anger their partner or to avoid verbal abuse or even physical abuse. The more they did this, the less they were connected to themselves, and they felt lots of negative feelings about this, including shame. Basically, the women she was studying were silencing themselves to survive in these relationships or make them work, and were acting in a way that was considered to be the way a woman was supposed to act. And they did that in order to get through the days, the weeks, and the years. And while things might have seemed like they were working, inside they were feeling worse and worse, and this could and often did culminate in clinical depression. Her work takes on the idea that people who are less empowered, and her work has been women, but they're given a bill of goods on how they're supposed to be in their relationships, according to what the world tells them to be, which is basically in a gendered, binary, is that you have to give in, take care of other people, shut up, and put up. And then when a woman gets stuck in these relationships, she blames herself. Does any of this sound familiar? It should, because as I read her papers, it hit me that self-silencing is what happens in every narcissistic relationship. And since Dr. Jack is suggesting that if someone self-silences, and that's associated with depression, well, then that makes sense, doesn't it? Most people in narcissistic relationships self-silence and self-silence for a long time. And while, yes, there's a subset of people who do get angry and get into it with the narcissistic person, the vast majority of people over time self-silence. It's the only way these relationships would persist. Now, Dr. Jack's take on this idea of silencing the self takes in different patterns, including a person evaluating themselves on the basis of standards that other people hold, that caring for other people is more important than your own needs, keeping quiet about expressing yourself to keep a relationship intact, and looking happy in a relationship on the outside while being pissed off or miserable inside. Again, all of this sounds familiar to anyone who's been in a narcissistic relationship, right? These are very similar to what happens to folks in any kind of relationship with an antagonistic or narcissistic person. Not all, of course, but ultimately that over time, a person needs to silence their needs and wants and be what the other person needs them to be to avoid conflict, to stay safe. That's the core of a narcissistic relationship. And Dr. Jack was not studying narcissistic relationships per se, but is merely studying what happens to people who developed depression or had significant levels of depression and what was happening within them. Dr. Jack wasn't concerning herself with what the other person in the relationship was doing. Now, part of the reason that there's so much confusion, even in the field of mental health, but certainly for survivors, is how so much of this work on what people do themselves in relationships when they cannot safely be themselves, it all overlaps, right? But I think we can learn from these overlaps that there is something that happens to a person who has less power in a relationship and feels a social, a societal, or a personal pressure to silence themselves, to stay safe and feel safe in a relationship. The basic math is that when you cannot be your authentic self in a relationship, it's never going to be good for you. And the fact is, you cannot show up and be yourself in a narcissistic relationship. Therefore, logically, it stands that narcissistic relationships are not good for you. At least that's my take on it. Other people may disagree. Now, given the strong association of self-silencing and depression, and given that this sort of self-silencing happens in narcissistic relationships, the next part of the science puzzle is to explore those relationships more, right? Which is something we're about to do in research I'm conducting on this. The more we have the theoretical and the data support for all of this, the more we can study this and figure out what can help people in toxic relationships. Gotta stay tuned, because the research is what's going to sort of turn this ship and give more attention to it. And we will feature links to Dr. Jack's research in the video notes if you're interested. And again, I'm on a science jag lately because, again, I'm pushing forward with folks on our own research into narcissistic relationship and what happens to people in them. But it's always a good idea to bring the science into this space so you can see that this isn't just sort of opinion or this is all in your head. It's very, very real. I'm going to put this to you as a question. How many of you found that over time that the way you talk to yourself is actually meaner than the way that the narcissist often talks to you? Give me that one in the comments and let's talk about this. Because this is what happens over time in narcissistic relationships. People start talking to themselves more mean than the narcissist talks to them. So let's start by thinking about the anatomy of a narcissistic relationship. Love bomb, devalue, future fake, gaslight, discard, hoover, on and on. You know how it works, right? As time goes on, even if you do understand what is happening to you, it's still quite likely that you're going to end up blaming yourself, doubting yourself, and even gaslighting or future faking yourself. You tell yourself that things will get better. You make deals with yourself. You say, I will do this or I will do that, and then I will make things better. You self-gaslight. You not only doubt yourself, you speak badly about yourself. You devalue yourself. You invalidate yourself. You minimize yourself. You call yourself stupid or crazy or worse. That's self-harming behavior, isn't it? And then over time, one of the worst things that can happen in a narcissistic relationship happens. We literally become our own perpetrators. It's as though we have so internalized the patterns of the narcissistic relationship. Perhaps we've mirrored them. Perhaps we're trying to get ahead of them. But we literally start doing to ourselves what the narcissists do to us. And it becomes an inner voice we can't get out of our heads. And that creates an even bleaker pattern. We are not only enduring the abuse from the narcissists and the enablers, but now we are doing it to ourselves. As a result, the negative talk, whether it's from the outside, from the narcissistic folks or the enablers, or the self-talk from ourselves, starts to become the only voice that we hear. Now, some of this relates to the cognitive dissonance. We need the pieces of our narratives, of what is happening around us, to fit, so we make them fit. Narcissistic relationships leave us feeling out of control. So the only thing we actually can control is how we talk to ourselves about them. Our own histories may make it more likely that we feel compelled to make it work and make the pieces fit, just as we might have done as kids if we had narcissistic parents. Well, Dad's yelling because he works really hard for us, or Mom doesn't mean what she says. She just had a really difficult childhood. I just need to be better. Well, if we want to make all of these conflicting pieces fit, just the way we did as kids, we may end up telling ourselves stories about ourselves. Oh, well, they aren't that bad. I'm the one who's too sensitive. I'm the one who's broken. I'm the one who's damaged because I came from a broken and damaged family, or I am doomed to only being in this kind of relationship. So I think I just need to put up and shut up. Maybe I just love drama. And we end up mirroring the patterns that we are observing. We basically talk to ourselves the way that the narcissists talk to us. And it becomes horribly consistent that way. No more dissonance. If we were to listen to how we talk to ourselves, it's actually quite horrifying. The things that I have heard survivors repeatedly say to themselves over the years include, I am an idiot. I am gross. I am disgusting. I don't deserve better. Well, if I share my needs with someone, I know they're going to leave, so I'm going to keep my mouth shut. Maybe this is as good as someone like me gets. I just need to be more patient. It's my fault. I'm really entitled, so I think it would get better quickly if I just change myself. No, there's something wrong with me. That's why the two of us belong together. I'm just a codependent fool. Yeah, I think I'm just drawn to toxic. I'm not trying hard enough. If I just try harder and just have more realistic expectations, it'll get better. And let me tell you, that's an unfortunate twist on the concept of realistic expectations. And then there's the, I am too old, I am too overweight, I am too broke, I am too haggard, pick your own self-insult, to think someone else will come along. I might as well stick this relationship out. I'm a bitch. My parents had a hard childhood. I'm a monster for expecting so much from them. Hey, throw in some of your negative self-talk in the comments too, though that's going to be real dark. In session for decades, I have had clients say to me, Dr. Ramani, I'm even afraid to talk to you today. I am so embarrassed at what I did, and you are going to hate me and lose all respect for me. I mean, with that build up, I'm waiting to hear what this horrible transgression they committed. I'm waiting for them to tell me they robbed a bank or something. And then I'll hear, you're not going to believe this, Dr. Ramani. I responded to their text. You hate me, right? You're going to fire me as a patient. And it just breaks my heart when I hear this. Because if they think the human behavior of simply responding to a text would result in a therapist slamming the door on them or being disappointed in them, It only means that they're saying terrible things and have terrible expectations of the world and for themselves all the time. It means they are living in so much shame over just doing normal stuff in relationships that are anything but normal. Now, if a narcissist leaves them as part of the discard, then this can become worse. Survivors believe that the relationships made them even more awful and will walk around asking themselves, I'm really awful. Actually, I think I'm the narcissist. Why would anyone want to stay with me? The descent into this self-betrayal, self-perpetration, call it what you want. And it's likely a mashup of mirroring and emulating the narcissist's language, not just from your current adult relationships, but perhaps also from childhood. And the internalization of those negating voices is a common pattern in almost all narcissistic relationships. Obviously, these are not relationships where you can walk around or talk or even think about your goodness. You don't get to walk around and think that you are strong or say things like, I'm valuable, I'm important, I'm lovable, I'm kind. Because that identity, if you had it for yourself, it's being invalidated on the daily. It is really hard to live in such an incongruous way, to constantly be told that you suck or you're mentally unwell. Because if at the same time you believe that you're good, something has to give. And if you stay in the relationship, the thing that ends up giving is you, how you talk about yourself. And before long, you are harming yourself as much as a narcissist is. It's a way to snap out of that dissonance, right? Even watching and reading and listening to content about narcissism, like this channel, hearing that these personalities and these patterns don't really change, and then a person knowing that still goes back into the relationship, then the person feels embarrassed. Like, oh my gosh, I'm watching these videos and I don't get it. Remember that most people take a long time before they really hit their rock bottom and get out, or that the narcissist finally leaves them. And then going back fuels the, oh, I'm so stupid. Or maybe for someone as dumb as me, this is it, because I keep going back. And even when someone finally may get out of a narcissistic or antagonistic relationship, they may continue this kind of self-harming talk by saying things like, I'm such an idiot that it took me 30 years to figure it out. Now, other things start to slip when we are in narcissistic relationships. We stop taking care of our health. We may not eat well, or take our medications, or get regular health care, or pursue interests that we care deeply about, or even keep up our space, our home, whatever, as well as we could, or as the way we want, or stop maintaining healthy relationships, or even stop having goals or dreams or aspirations. With everything being invalidated, your life can feel like it devolves into a why bother? And then a person looks around and says, well, look at my life, it's a mess. I don't do anything. I feel like crap, so it must be me. I suck. I'm no good. But the life force gets sucked out of us in these narcissistic relationships. So here is a thought and something to try. I want you to think of how you talk to yourself as an adult, right? The things you say to yourself, the ways you view yourself. Then I want you to find a picture of yourself as a small child. And I want you to say those things to that picture. Really, look at that beautiful wee little picture of you, cute as can be, and tell that little you that they're an idiot, or they're foolish or damaged. This isn't easy to do. I want you to give it a shot, so you stop doing it to yourself now, because you're the same person. And sadly, I know for some of you, these things were said to you at that little person age, but do it. Tell that beautiful small you the things you say to yourself now. It's a picture, but you'll feel it. It doesn't feel good. In fact, it's painful. And it may be too painful, which I understand. And if this exercise feels triggering, you don't feel compelled to do it, or to do it with a therapist or someone guiding you. But that little you is the same spirit in the big you. Please stop talking to yourself that way. It's not okay. Somehow the visual of saying it to even the image of an innocent child may snap you back into how awful these things you are saying to yourself really are. The way we talk to ourselves shapes our reality. When we tell ourselves that we are damaged or stupid, we lean into that identity. To me, that is the ultimate tragedy of narcissistic abuse. We harm ourselves and reality every day by using the language of the narcissist to refer to ourselves. Because you are still that little person carrying those core wounds. So when you want to use all of that damaging language to talk about yourself, please stop. I get it. You learn to talk this way about yourself and about yourself after a long time of hearing it and doing it. But it's time to stop. Catch yourself. The narcissist will still invalidate, but it's time for you to learn a new vocabulary and to stop doing the narcissistic people's dirty work. So for a narcissistic relationship to work, you have to give in to what works for the narcissistic person. That's the basic and most singular rule of engagement in these relationships. Now, this doesn't happen overnight. It happens very slowly. Slowly but surely, initially you might have even held your ground, gotten into the arguments, but you slowly stop holding your ground. You hold back more. You walk on eggshells. You may stop contradicting them or even hope that they are listening. But in addition to that, there is something even more nefarious happening. You slowly but surely learn to turn off your light. It doesn't happen all at once. These are relationships, like I said, of indoctrination, of the slow burn. You don't consciously wake up one day and say, I'm going to focus on making myself small and I'm going to make sure I don't excel or shine. But we almost get, for lack of a better word, I'm going to say, we almost get trained in these relationships to not have our light shine. And there are a few reasons for this. If your light is shining in a narcissistic relationships, and in some ways you almost become like an open target, the narcissistic person may feel competitive with you, jealous of you, and as you excel, you become a bigger target for them to take down. Children who grow up in narcissistic family systems will recall that in a weird way, it was almost as though their narcissistic parent was competitive with them. Though that would not become clear to you. You're not going to make sense of that as a kid. It wouldn't become clear to you until you were well into adulthood. As you excel, there is a schadenfreude type of glee that the narcissistic person almost gets in the face of your setbacks. They actually are kind of happy when they see you set back a little bit. And they're willing to participate in those setbacks and make them happen. There also may be mockery. They may minimize or trivialize whatever you accomplished or whatever good thing you're doing. They may devalue the things you do. And a real struggle is, especially if you have a vulnerable, victimized, passive-aggressive narcissistic person in your life, they may become quite sullen if you succeed. They may become angry, quiet. They may even start putting themselves down. And as so many of us do, we may downplay our achievements to soothe them, to appease them, so they don't feel less than us. We may even feel guilty about doing well. Their victimhood may boil down to, nothing good happens to me, even though I deserve it more than you. And it will always leave you feeling a little funny. But if it's you that is succeeding, then the whole thing feels like a convoluted mess. And then you may face the heavy-handed play of them sort of threatening to step away from the relationship or leave it. There may be a vibe of, well, you're off doing your own thing now. You don't need me hanging around. And again, if you have a nice bone in your body, you may try to fit them into the good thing that's happening. You may try to put them front and center with you in your accomplishment. Share the glory, talk them up, tell other people how instrumental the narcissistic person was in your success, just so they feel as though they are part of it. And then they don't leave you. And of course, by definition, narcissistic people are competitive. And this competitiveness may translate into them trying to beat you at your own game, or to do so much better at their own stuff that you are eclipsed. They may also try to insinuate themselves into your stuff. If you are running a business, they may try to worm themselves in there to be a part of something you did most of the legwork on. And again, out of guilt, pity, and trauma bonding, you may allow them to join your venture. And I promise you, you will regret doing that for the rest of your life. But your success, your moment in the sun, your spotlight, even if it's not ostensible honors and praise and awards kind of thing, but just maybe that you're a bright, happy person whose light attracts people to you. They're not going to like that either, and may put you down and say things like, oh my gosh, you're like a big dumb dog, or why do you need so much attention, or they'll accuse you of being fake, or other things that are simply not true. And the downstream effect of all of this is that slowly but surely you start turning down your own light significantly. Being bright and being seen by others or succeeding almost feels dangerous, setting you up to be insulted, humiliated, jabbed at, mocked, or even turned into a joke. While you know, I don't want you to share your accomplishments of good things that happen to you with the narcissistic folks. The problem and the danger is you may just stop sharing them with everyone. And not just because you are humble, but because it becomes a safety response that you've learned to turn your own light off. You may become more subdued in social groups, even though that is not your way, but because it feels safer. You may not laugh as loud. And the bigger problem is that you may not put yourself out there, and you may hold yourself back in other ways. You may not try new things. You may not take a chance on a new idea, not invest in yourself, and not take center stage when it's appropriate, and you would in fact be a real asset. You turn down, and you ultimately turn off your own light. The terrible thing about this is that the narcissistic folks around you are just fine with this. They won't take note of the fact that you did it, and you may even barely notice that you did. The funny thing is when we engage in behaviors to feel safe in our relationships, we rarely notice them. We're doing them to stay safe. They aren't a tactic. They're a way of us protecting ourselves, and even a response to what feels like a threat, and a way for us to be able to maintain a relationship with someone who's manipulative, but perhaps we don't quite get it yet. And as you keep turning your light down, theirs can continue to shine, which, like I said, is an imbalance and an asymmetry that they're okay with. The sense people get, whether when they're growing up with narcissistic parents or being in narcissistic relationships, is that basically not existing is the safest place to be. So as a result, keeping yourself subdued and quiet and unseen becomes safety, and your light gets turned off. And this has major ramifications for healing, because as you navigate your way through radical acceptance and grief and guilt, you will get to a place of autonomy and individuation. That time when you start getting to be you allowing you to be in the world as yourself, and either learning to not give a damn about what the narcissistic person thinks, or they're out of your life. And then you find that little pull cord or switch to turn, like a light switch on your back, and slowly turn it on. And when you first do it, it'll feel like the light is dimmed, and then you will slowly make it brighter, move that dimmer switch up. And even as you initially do this, you will be waiting for someone to jump out and call you out and say, oh gosh, you're such a show-off, to make fun of you, to berate you, to shame you. It's a sort of hypervigilance that people who have been through narcissistic abuse have about being seen, especially in the early phases of healing. When we do these things to maintain and stay safe in our relationships, we also tell ourselves stories to make it fit. We tell ourselves that we don't have much to say, that we aren't that good at things, that it's hubris or bad form for us to draw attention to ourselves, that we are attention-seeking exhibitionists for simply wanting to share something that we know. This is how narcissistic people control us and keep us down. And this is why turning your light back on, coming into yourself, and learning to disengage from their opinions of you is so important. Because when it comes down to it, they aren't noticing you enough to really know what you are doing. Narcissistic people are better programmed to view folks as threats than to really take notice of what you are genuinely doing. And so shutting you down allows them to maintain power. Their criticism of you isn't even based on them knowing what you are about. It's merely a projection of their insecurity. I say this at length in my book, and I reinforce it here. You have to turn that light of yours back on for no other reason than the world needs what you can offer it, your ideas, your creativity, your knowledge, your true you. And I am not saying this as a vapid, positive pump up. I am saying this as seriously. You may know shit we need to know, and you not sharing it may actually be slowing progress down for lots of people. It's a tentative crawling back for you, and it's a tentative emergence. I remember as a kid wanting to be seen like this, watching with absolutely rapt curiosity at kids who were seen like this and wondering what it felt like. It's actually bizarre that I share my work publicly because I still to this day do believe, who the hell do I think I am doing this in front of a camera? And I do wonder how much of my introversion is really me and how much of it is the safety of my preference for not being seen. I'm not saying that any of this is easy. It's not. But when we recognize that we did turn off our lights and that was one more trauma response, one more safety response, one more attempt by us to try to maintain attachments with other people, in the most basic way, we turned off our lights as a way to show the narcissistic people we love them. And folks, that's not love. That's subjugation. So figure out where your switch is, start slow, and recognize the function that originally happened, that you turned your light off. Why did you do that? Because I'll tell you, it only served one person's needs, and that was the narcissistic folks, the people who believed that anyone else's light would obscure theirs. So get those lights back on, and as you do that, you light a path for people who are starting their own process of healing too. Thanks again.